Right, okay, I'm here. What I'm going to do is read a bit on forgiveness to help people out there who've got complex PTSD to understand what forgiveness may mean and to explore the, to explore what forgiveness means and to get away from the consensus beliefs around forgiveness that are very damaging to people that have been through hardship and abuse, and where you struggle thinking that you have to forgive heinous stuff that happened to you in childhood, and where maybe you're feeling a lot of guilt and shame and toxic shame because you're unable to forgive, and maybe you've been trying for years and maybe you've got a lot of guilt. And I know that when I was forcing myself to forgive, I turned to spirituality in order to try and get myself to forgive. I've never particularly hurt anybody in my life personally. I've not been 100% perfect as a person, but I've not done anything that's heinous to another human being. And when we've had heinous treatment in childhood, particularly by parents or at school or from adults, it affects us in ways where we might feel very bitter and upset and have anger. And we don't understand that, we think we've got to forgive. We sort of trying to force ourselves. And the more we can't forgive and the more we force ourselves to try and forgive, the worse we feel. So it's almost like we end up punishing ourselves really in a heavy duty way. And then what can happen is, and for some people, they'll try and disassociate because they feel so much guilt and shame. They will disassociate through maybe using drugs or alcohol or overeating or various, so many different things people can do. So I'm sure I think I'm online. I can see if anybody got any questions or wants to chat, then you can chat in the chat box, and I'm, happy to answer any questions. But I'm going to be reading from a section from Pete Walker on forgiveness. It's in the book called Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And I'm going to read this book and then just 2 pages, and then some reparenting affirmations that are going to help you to also, which I'll post below in the link when I finish this video. I'll put the reparenting affirmations, which are for yourself to heal your inner child. And I'm going to just read this article on Forgiveness Begins with Self, and it's by Pete Walker. And it's also in his book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, which you'll find below in the links. Okay, so this is what he says, and you can let me know if this resonates with you. He says, there has been a lot of shaming and dangerous and inaccurate guidance put out about forgiveness in the last few years in both the recovery community and in transpersonal circles. So that would be in spiritual groups and stuff like that. And also it's religious, religious beliefs that we have to forgive and so on and so forth. And then he says, many survivors of dysfunctional families have been injured by the simplistic black and white advice that decrees that they must embrace a position of being totally and permanently forgiving in order to recover. So if you can think that if you've been through, a really heavy duty childhood, different types of abuse, be it physical, emotional, verbal, sexual, spiritual abuse by adults when you were a child, then what happens is that we're under this belief that we've got to forgive, and that religions will tell us that, because particularly if it's parents, that's a religious belief and it's consensus reality. And that the belief that the only way we're going to recover is by being forgiving, and which is a double-edged sword for people who've been through abuse, because, is it true that that is the only way to heal? And we have to figure that one out for ourselves. But this is something I'm just going to keep reading and see what you think for yourselves. He says here, unfortunately, those who have taken the advice to forgive abuses that have not been fully grieved, or abuses that are still occurring, and or abuses so heinous they should and could never be forgiven, often find themselves getting nowhere in their recovery process. In fact, the possibility of attaining real feelings of forgiveness is usually lost when there is a premature cognitive decision to forgive. So that means that you're forcing yourself to forgive. It's like you're saying, I've forgiven these people that did this to me. I've forgiven the person who stole $1,000 dollars from me, or I've forgiven the person who, you know, really was damaging to me, for instance. This is because premature forgiving intentions, so he's saying that premature forgiving intentions mimic the defenses of denial and repression. So the idea is here that if we force ourselves to forgive something, like a light switch, I'm going to forgive you for whatever you've done to me, it's basically then that what we're doing is we're going into repression, and we're also going into denial of what happened to us, meaning that we're not grieving what needs to be grieved. Then he says they keep unprocessed feelings of anger and hurt about childhood unfairness out of awareness. So what happens is when we keep those things out of awareness, like, you know, maybe we get into our teenage years and we're told we've just, sometimes what's incredible that people who've abused you will tell you that you've got to learn to forgive them, which is, I mean, as an adult, I find that quite comical. Now, when I look at that, I've heard that myself, where, you know, you've got to learn to forgive. I'm charming, so you abused me for years and now I've got to learn to forgive you. I mean, if that just isn't more abuse, I don't know what is, but there you go. That's just my view. Going on, he says, real forgiveness is quite distinct from premature forgiveness. It is almost always a byproduct of effective grieving, and no amount of thought, intention, or belief can bring it into being without a dissension into the feeling realms. So in order to forgive, what's, you know, if that's what we really want to do, what happens is if we start grieving, and, you know, proper grieving, like the losses and the loss, abandonment and betrayal in our childhood, the lost years, the abuse, the hurt, the offenses that were carried out on us, if we begin to grieve those times as adults and really see that our inner child was not nurtured and not loved, and we begin to have a healthy anger, so I reiterate there, healthy anger and healthy blame, what happens is we get to a point through our grieving and getting rid of our own inner critic, who will toxically shame us into fake forgiveness or false forgiveness. What happens is eventually we realize that there is nothing so much to forgive, because we begin to, we're releasing the pain. The only reason that we think that we should forgive is that we are still in pain. If there's no pain, there is nothing to forgive. This is how I see forgiveness myself. But Pete Walker goes on here. He says, conversely, cognitive and philosophical structures, unreceptive to the possibility of forgiveness, sometimes block the access to forging feelings, even when such feelings are present. It might be that the most healthy cognitive position concerning forgiveness is an attitude that allows the possibility of its occurrence on the other side of the extensive grieving. So you might find some days you feel forgiving, and some days you think, wow, I was really treated badly and that really hurts. And you might have had a nightmare or something. You might think you've forgiven something that's been heinous, and then you'll go to sleep, you'll have a nightmare and wake up in a cold sweat in the night, like PTSD, complex PTSD, remembering, you know, or you might have OCD because of what you've been through, or you might, you know, be shutting yourself off from people. So the idea of forgiveness really needs to be looked at, because, you know, there was a point in society, this isn't Pete Walker, but I'm saying myself, there was a point in society where religion, you know, going back thousands and thousands of years, religion as we know it now did not exist. And if somebody was offensive or going to take your life, or they were going to be abusive to you, you know, maybe thousands of years ago, you would have got out of their way and you wouldn't play with them. You would, you know, you would be able to escape it. The thing is, as children, we've got no choice. If we have an abusive parent or a carer or something at school, for instance, or we were basically in a position where there is nowhere to go. We haven't got the, you know, the mind. There's nothing we can do as a child. As an adult, for instance, we can bring that childhood stuff into our adulthood, and we can end up in relationships where people are not very nice and a bit heinous and or unkind, and well put up with that behavior. Or we might have a boss who's not, you know, very, or maybe demeaning, or we might have demeaning people in our lives. But because we believe this stuff that we've been programmed with, our early imprints as children, we don't stand up for ourselves. So this is, again, I'll continue with forgiveness, but we can see the idea there. It's like, you know, we need to work on our stuff to heal it. So then he says, the attitude will work best if it includes the condition that feelings of forgiveness, so this is the important thing, that feelings of forgiveness will not be forced or forcefully invoked to cover up any unresolved feelings of hurt and anger. The easiest way to heal hurt and anger is by feeling the hurt and the anger. So if somebody's made you angry, it's better to feel it rather than say, oh, I'm not going to be angry with them, because, or feel angry with them. Because if we're angry, we're angry. Our emotions are important signals to see us through life and for our survival, to keep us alive. So he says, in this vein, it is also especially important to note that certain types of abuse, this is important, are so extreme and damaging to the victim. I don't particularly like the word victim, but, you know, I'd say that something happened to me and I have no, you know, but the word is victim, but it's not a word I particularly like. But he does say, I'm going to read this bit again. In this vein, it is also especially important to note that certain types of abuse are so extreme and damaging to the victim that forgiveness may simply not be an option. So some of us, and I would say me included, have been through some stuff that was so damaging that forgiveness is simply not an option. The only option is that we go and get therapy and psychoeducate ourselves by reading books and like watching videos like this. Like I've watched videos like this on YouTube years ago to try and help me solve my problems of feeling guilty for not being able to forgive somebody that was really heinous to me. So then he says, not an option. Then he says, trying to control and pick our emotions, they are still by definition the human condition, largely outside the province of our choice of will. So there's some things that we can't choose. Some things were so heinous that, you know, we're not in a position to even choose. He says, forgiveness then, at best, like love, remains a human feeling experience. So forgiveness is a human feeling experience, like love. So we can't force ourselves to love somebody. And when I'm talking about love, I mean, we can love everybody in the spiritual terminology and unconditional love, if that's what we want to do. But at the same time, when we fall in love with somebody or we feel love for somebody like a sibling or a friend, we can't force that. That's just what we feel. So that is the same with forgiveness. So forgiveness then, at best, like love, remains a human feeling experience that can only temporarily be ours. So it's our feeling. When grieving has been thorough enough to be reintegrated as normal and easily accessible process of the psyche, love and forgiveness can also become our consciously chosen values. So it can become a value, but we have to grieve first. It's like we can't, you know, put in a Band-Aid on, you know, a wound that you've not cleaned means that it's going to become infected. So that's the same thing as putting forgiveness on heinous abuse or emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse. So it's like a wound. It needs to be cleaned out before it can begin to heal. So then he says, this can happen in the later stages of recovery when we begin to notice and experience that functional processing and grieving of interpersonal hurts and often lead us quite naturally back into loving feelings. So for instance, I'm quite a loving person, but sometimes I don't feel loving. You know, when I remember some of the stuff that happened to me, I go into flashback and I don't feel loving. And we've got to understand that it's okay to feel what we feel. Thus, when I am hurt, he says, by intimates, I may not be able to immediately invoke loving or forgiving feelings towards them, but I know that with sufficient communication and non-abusive venting, I will be able to return to an appreciative experience of them. So for instance, you might have a friend who does something that annoys you, and then you tell them, and then you might be really annoyed with them and cross with them, and then you discuss it in a non-abusive way, and then you can come back to feeling loving feelings for them again. So then I will be able to return to an appreciative experience of them. As much as I can forgive myself, that much can I forgive others. What I really forgive in others is an old pain of mine, released from the disgust of self-hate and loved and welcomed like a bird with a broken wing. So we welcome ourselves like a, a wounded child or a wounded little bird. We're going to nurture it. We're not going to, tell it how awful it is and there's something wrong with it. We're going to, so then he says, shame and self-hate did not start with me. So we have to remember this, that the shame that we feel and the self-hatred we feel did not start with us. But with all my heart, I design, he says, shame and self-hate did not start with me, but with all my heart, I deign that they will stop with me. I will do unto myself as I would have others do unto me. So we start treating ourselves differently. Now, what I'm going to do now is read a little section that I'll put below this video in one of the comments boxes. Okay, so if you've been through abuse and it's really difficult to recover from this stuff, you need to get the book below. It's got 13 steps for managing flashbacks that you'll see below this video. There's a link, and also 14 steps for managing your inner critic. And then I'm going to read a part from the book, and this is called Reparenting Affirmations. So this would be something like if you're reparenting your inner child, because if you weren't nurtured, then we've got to reparent ourselves so that we can begin to have a normal, when I say normal, it was like a healthy life, and not toxic shame, guilting, shaming, and telling ourselves how horrible we are. So this is what we would say. And you can imagine you say this to yourself. You'll be able to print this off if you'll be able to access this below. So, I am so glad that you were born. You are a good person and I love you, and you are, and I am doing my best to always be on your side. You can come to me whenever you're feeling hurt or bad. You do not have to be perfect to get my love and protection. You do not have to be perfect to get my love and protection. And all of your feelings are okay with me. I am always glad to see you. It is okay for you to be angry, and I won't let you hurt yourself or others when you are. You can make mistakes. They are your teachers. You can know what you need to ask when you need help. You can have your own preferences and tastes. You are a delight to my eyes. You can choose your own values, and you can pick your own friends, and you don't have to like everyone. You can sometimes feel confused and ambivalent and not know all the answers. I am very proud of you. So what we begin to do is we begin to treat ourselves like our own inner child. Like when I started doing my inner child work, my little girl, she was about 4 years old or 5. And I pretend, when I was walking up the road to do something or whatever, going out to get a pint of milk, whatever we do in life, I pretended that I was holding her hand and walking slowly with her, giving her the time. But it's quite funny. My inner child now has got to be like a baby, and I sit her on my hip. I've not had children myself, but in my imagination, I image this little beautiful child, me, on my hip, and I'll kiss her forehead. I'm giving her love. And that is the connection with ourselves. That inner child is always in us. So we need to be aware that the changes that we seek are going to come, they come from inside ourselves. There is nobody out there that's going to make us feel better permanently. Even if we have a good friend or a lover or we're married or whatever the situation is for us, ultimately the real true healing, whilst it's going to come through working with others, ultimately it's going to come through our own psyche, working with ourselves and getting the psychoeducation, getting therapy if we need it, and really working on ourselves and re-nurturing ourselves like we should have been nurtured when we were kids. The unfortunate thing is most people that did not nurture us or abused us, they were abused. We are here to break that cycle, and we start with ourselves. So I hope this is useful to anybody watching. Nobody's made any comments, but I've got a ladies group over on Facebook just for ladies on CPTSD and anxiety. So find me over on Facebook. And I also, I do astrology videos as well. I will look at trauma in astrology charts if people have their time of birth. So there's quite a few things I do, but this is part of my service to the world because I went through so much trauma myself and suffered so much. I'm giving back because I know that the book Complex PTSD is the map to healing it. Okay, that's it. I'm going now. Catch you later and have a good rest of the day wherever you are. Thanks.